Greetings, genealogists. This is Kay Rudolph with the fourth and final episode based on Paul Graham's case study, A Love Story Proved: The Life and Family of Laura Lavinia Kelly Combs of Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia. The origin of the legend dates from Carter's 1894 publication, The Black Side: A Partial History of the African American Community in Atlanta. And in that history, he noted that Mary Combs was the first colored person to own property in this city. Her property occupied the place where Wheat Street meets Peachtree Street. This property she sold, and with the proceeds purchased her husband. In episode 1, we examined research that had taken place in 1977 and determined that that research was incorrect in its findings. In part 2, we identified Laura Combs, who we believe is the woman who Carter was describing in his 1894 history. In part 3, we traced Laura Combs' life. We found that she was born around 1824, 1825. She had a number of children and appears to have passed away before 1872. But we have several questions that arose out of this research. One is, she alternated her surnames between Combs and Kelly. Second, why did she have a guardian in 1855? And third, why did her son, Oswald Combs, need to quit claim his interest in this property at Wheat and Pryor that had been the legal property of Jane Combs in 1860? And finally, what does any of this have to do with Laura's husband, John Combs? Our goal in this episode is to explain what's going on. And to do that, we're going to need to research the laws that governed Laura's behavior during her life. In particular, we're going to want to focus on the statutes in Georgia in effect in the period of 1850 to 1860. To do that, I go to our friend Google search and I do a basic search for Georgia Codified Statutes history. My attention is caught by this one result here: History of the Codification of the Laws of Georgia. This is a nice overview of the different codes as Georgia adopted them over time, and it helps us understand what we're going to be looking for to cover that period of 1850 to 1860 that is most of interest in Laura's life. It notes here that Thomas Cobb published a digest of codes in 1851, and Howell Cobb published a follow-on digest in 1859. So going back to our search results, we have this link to historic Georgia digests and codes, and we can zoom straight to this 1851 and 1859 digests. Looking at the 1851 digest, I did a search for free person of color, and I got a variety of results. I can see that they're clustered in this group here. So I go to that section and I find the index to the sections of code relating to slaves, patrols, and free persons of color. Now, this first question, why did Laura use a different surname? Reading through this code, essentially an individual's status as free or slave followed the condition of the mother. Laura was freeborn because she was born of a mother who was free. That would suggest that her use of the surname Kelly was her mother's surname, and she used that surname when she needed to assert her position as a freeborn person. She used the surname Combs, her husband's name, otherwise. The next question we had is, why did Laura have a guardian? One reason was that it was unlawful for any person to give credit to a free person of color unless with a written order of her guardian. But even more important, this section notes that her children, her male children over the age of 8, could have been bound out into indentured servitude until they reached 21 years old unless they had a guardian. So it was critical for her to have a guardian in order to safeguard her family's legal rights and in order to be able really to function in society. So how does Laura's enslaved husband fit into the facts that we have gathered about Laura? Well, first thing of interest is to note that no free person of color shall be permitted to purchase or acquire any real estate or any slave or slaves. Now, that real estate section was amended in 1819, which is why Laura was able to legally purchase property and legally own property, but she did not have the right to purchase her husband's freedom. And in fact, there were fines levied and informers paid off for informing on people who broke the code. It was very strict about who could be manumitted. The only way a slave could be manumitted would be with the authorization of the state legislature. And again, informers would be paid for their information for people who were breaking this code. It was even illegal for clerks of the court to record any document, any deed or manumission or other paper which had the option of manumitting and setting free any slave or slaves. State law voided any contract or will that attempted to free a slave. Every will and testament, deed, whether by way of trust or otherwise, contract, agreement, stipulation, or other instrument in writing, by parole, made and executed for the purpose of effecting and endeavoring to effect the manumission of any slave or slaves, either directly by conferring or attempting to confer freedom on such slaves, indirectly or virtually, by allowing and securing or attempting to allow and secure to such slave or slaves the right or privilege of working for his, her, or themselves, free from the control of the master or owner of such slave or slaves, or enjoying the profits of his, her, or their labor or skill, shall be and the same are hereby declared to be utterly null and void. In this case, the fine was up to $1,000 for any person attempting to execute such a document, and any slaves who were attempted to be set free were sold back into slavery. And of course, the proceeds of such sales would go back to those informers. Looking at the 1859 statutes, we find that as of 1852, there was a change in the rule to authorize the sale of real estate for free persons of color, specifically to provide for the disposition of the proceeds of the sale. In this case, they specified no sale shall be valid without the permission of the court of ordinary, which court shall prescribe the mode and property in which the proceeds shall be disposed of or invested. Can we find any authorization of the court to sell Laura's property? We're going to look for the Court of Ordinary in Fulton County, Georgia, and we're going to search for the names Alexander or Kelly or Combs, Alexander being her guardian's name, Kelly her apparent freeborn name, Combs her married name. Going to the Family Search Wiki, looking up an article on Georgia court records, I do a search for the term ordinary, using Control F to open up the search box. That takes me down to this section here that tells me there's two ways to access the court records in the Family Search Catalog. One is by doing a search for place name, which we've been using in the past, or by searching for the author, Georgia Court of Ordinary. Let's try that. I actually copied the text and pasted here, Georgia Court of Ordinary, in the field for author name. That returns for every county in Georgia. I can scroll through and select Fulton County, examine which of these collections is most likely to be relevant. Court records 1829 to 1931. Open that collection up, scroll down, and we'll work through these different volumes. Opening volume A and going to the index, I worked through. I did not find any authorizing order under either Alexander, Combs, or Kelly in that period 1854 to 1867, which is when the land would have had to been sold. We knew that she was on the land as a listed property owner in 1854, according to that deed that we found for her neighbor Monday, and we know that by 1860, Jane Combs was the legal owner of that property. To be sure, I double-checked and went through and looked at the DeKalb County for 1854 to 1862, and again found no authorizing order under Alexander, Combs, or Kelly. To be double sure, check the deed. Searching Fulton County and DeKalb County deeds, I found no deed whatsoever for the sale of Laura's land. So we do not find Laura selling the land, and we know that we will not find a deed for Laura purchasing her husband John Combs, because that was illegal. Can we find any document that links John Combs to Jane Combs? Jane Combs was the legal owner of Laura's property in 1860. John Combs was listed as Laura's husband in 1870. Can we find a connection between those two individuals? That takes us to Plan F. We want to see if we can find some record linking Jane Combs as the slaveholder of Laura's husband, John. To do that, we're going to want to trace Jane and Mary back to locate their birth family. We're going to look for them in the 1850 and the 1840 censuses. And then we're going to look to see if we can find some document that references John. Now, we had in the 1860 census, we saw earlier that we found Jane and Mary Combs living in Atlanta, Georgia. When I had searched for the 1850 census for Mary Combs living in Atlanta, I had not found any record. Likewise, when I searched for a Jane Combs, born in Georgia, living anywhere in Georgia, you'll note here in the 1860 census, she was listed as 50 years old, which would suggest she was born in 1810. So I left a very broad time frame for her year of birth, a plus or minus 10 years, and I still get no result. After trying a number of different avenues for searching for Jane and Mary, it occurred to me to search for Jane and Mary. And so I did a search for Mary, clicking that I required that exact name, birthplace in Georgia, and I clicked that to restrict my search. And FamilySearch.org provides the option of searching by another person in the household. And so I set another person in the household's name to Jane and set that exactly. Okay, I get 1,300 results, but I'm not done yet. I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to use my place filters, and I'm going to filter down to DeKalb County. Remember, that's where Atlanta was located in 1850. When I do that, I have only 8 results for the 1850 census. And I scanned through these, looking for a name that might have been misconstrued as Combs by an indexer. Looking at this index entry, it doesn't look like a promising result. We have a Jane and Mary Carnes, and there is the third name, Sarah. We'd expect to find those three names together, but they're in a household with a Martha and a Nancy Mackleby. But the most significant problem is that it suggests that Jane is age 60 in 1850, which would have her born in 1790. Way too early to be our Jane. But we're going to take a look at the actual image. It's never enough to look at the index. You need to look at the image itself. Before we leave this page, though, there's one other thing I want you to note, and that is their house number. This is which line in the census you're going to be locating their household. And it says that they're in household 279. So we click on the thumbnail and we scan through the page. I was looking for Jane, Mary, and Sarah and didn't find them. And then I realized the last entry on this page is for household 276. So I had to go to the next page and scroll down, and here we have household 279. You can see this is Jane. It's a little hard to read. But one thing I want to point out, we have a separation in these two households. The indexer listed these two children as being in Jane's household, as you see here. But they are actually part of the household above. So what we have here is a household of three women, Jane, Mary, and Sarah. It's a little hard to read, so let's go up and use the tools to adjust the image. And tweaking it around, we can see this looks like C-O-M-E-S possibly, Jane Combs. I can see how the indexer read it as Carnes, but I'm comfortable that that is a C-O-M. She's not 60 years old either. Looking more carefully, it looks like she's listed here as 45, which would have her birth in 1805, in line with what we have seen in the 1860 census, which had her birth at 1810. It's not unexpected to see people's ages off a little bit. Mary, age 32, Sarah J., age 15. Comparing their ages in 1850 to what we have from the 1880 census, Sally was 41 in 1880. She would have been 11 in 1850. Mary was listed as 64 in 1880. She would have been 34 in 1850. These numbers do match fairly closely to those we have in this 1850 census. So now we're looking for an 1840 household with a female who's age 40, a female who is age 30, and a female around 5 years old. That would be young Sarah. Again, I do a search for Combs, restricting the residence to Georgia, otherwise leaving it open. Select only the 1840 collection. We have 23 possible results. I go through one by one, and only one result fits that profile. We have here this household of Pamela or Pamela Combs. It has a woman aged 30 to 40. That would have been born between 1800 and 1810, fitting Jane. We have a woman aged 20 to 30. That would be Mary's profile. And we have a female child under age 5. That would be Sarah's. So we have our family of Mary and Jane and Sarah Combs living in Putnam County, Georgia, in the household of Pamela or Permella Combs, who is 50 to 60 years old, likely Mary and Jane's mother. The next thing that we want to do is we want to see if we can locate a will that names our Mary and Jane and refers to John Combs. Going to the Family Search Catalog, I find this result for an index to Georgia wills. Unfortunately, this is a book that would only be available at the Family History Library. I'm going to check the WorldCat link here to see if there's an availability closer to me. It is available at the West Florida Public Library, only 20 minutes away. I'm a little lazy, so I want to see if I can locate this elsewhere online. The fact that it has been abstracted suggests to me that it might be worth looking at US GenWeb. This is a website that is built from volunteers entering transcribed and abstracted records. So I do a search for US GenWeb, and I'm particularly interested in US GenWeb archives because I'm going to want to do an archival search. So I click on that and it opens up to a list of the states. I'm going to go to Georgia. I see over here there's an option for wills. That might solve my problem right there. I click on wills. Unfortunately, this is just a very small collection. I could sort through all of these other counties, but right now I'm not really confident that I know where they might be located. We have them in Putnam County in 1850 and Fulton County later, but did they move somewhere in between? I'm not sure. I'm going to want to do a search of the entire set of Georgia records on the US GenWeb archives. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the URL here for one of these page results. This was the result for the Georgia wills. I'm going to copy that stub, usgwarchives.net/GA, and I'm going to do a site search. I'm going to paste that into my search box on Google Search, and I'm going to include the search terms Combs in quotation marks, Jane, and Mary also in quotation marks. So I am looking for any web page result that has these three words, Combs and Jane and Mary, and that is on this website. And we have 72 results, but my eye is caught by this first one because what I'm really looking for is a will. And so the first result, Georgia Coweta County Will Book A, really catches my eye. And we're seeing here a transcript of Will Book A for Coweta County. I do a search for the term Combs. That takes me down to where that abstract has been transcribed. Note the name Permella. This matches that name from the 1840 census. Permella. Also, we have Jane and Mary listed as her daughters, and we have her granddaughter, Sarah J. Combe. That would match Jane's niece and Mary's daughter. Let's take a closer look. To do that, the abstract tells us that we're looking for Will Book A, page 87. This was a will written 12 June 1843. So we go to the Family Search Catalog, and do a place search for Coweta County, Georgia. Scroll down and look for the probate records and look through for the will books. Coweta County, Georgia probate records 1826 to 1966 looks like our list of volumes. We scroll to this. Here is volume A. We click on that. Here we have the thumbnails for all of the images. We know that we want page 87, but I'm interested in looking at the index to see if there are any other combs listed. Now, I was surprised when I looked through that I did not find any combs at all. And I checked through all the pages. I found that there were 2 pages listing C's, but there was not a single one listing the name Combs. So I was very glad that we had that abstract to direct us directly to page 87. And I go to page 87, and here it is. I, Parmelia Combs, of the county and state aforesaid, being of sound disposing mind and memory, do hereby make and declare this to be my last will and testament. And note her first item: I give and bequeath unto my daughter Jane Combs a Negro boy by the name of John. So this is the link that we were looking for. We now know that Jane Combs was the slave owner of Laura's husband John, and that Laura's land at Wheat Street and Pryor Street, what Carter had called Wheat Street and Peachtree Street, Jane Combs ultimately was the legal owner of that land. We never found any deed for Jane purchasing that land from Laura, nor any record where Jane manumitted John. How did they pull this off? Unfortunately, that's one question we'll probably never be able to answer. Given what we know about the law and the reward system that was set up to encourage people to inform against slaves who were illegally manumitted, the restrictions that there were on registering persons of color to ensure that they were truly free. This section of the law here stresses that it would be unlawful for the clerk of any county in this state to register as free persons of color, or to grant a certificate of such registry to any person of color who shall not establish by proof to the satisfaction of the inferior court of said county that he or she applying so to be registered is bona fide and truly a free person of color according to and under the laws of this state, or has been registered in this state, or has exercised all the privileges of a free person of color for 5 years before the passing of this act. That dates back to 1835, and we know that John was enslaved in 1843 at the time Parmelia Combs willed him to her daughter. Furthermore, any clerk violating the restriction would be fined $300, again have to be paid to the informer. Nor was it possible for John to claim to have just entered the state, because no free person of color was allowed to come into the state from another state on pain of a $100 fine, and if he remained, the threat of being sold as a slave. What we do know, in 1843, John, an enslaved man, was deeded to Jane Combs. In 1850, Laura, a free woman of color, who used the name Laura Kelly on her legal records, was enumerated in Atlanta under the name of Laura Combs. In 1854, Laura Combs was listed as the legal owner of a lot on the southeast corner of Wheat Street and Pryor Street. It's not surprising to see this using her common name, Laura Combs, rather than her legal name, Laura Kelly, because that 1854 deed was for a neighbor's property, and it was referring to her in the boundary description for that neighbor's property. By 1860, that property that Laura was listed as owning was being treated as the legal property of Jane Combs. The property was sold as a consequence of Jane losing a lawsuit, and that same day it was deeded back to her by the purchaser. In 1870, Laura identified her husband's name as John and her son as Oswald A. Combs. In 1886, Laura's son Oswald signed a quitclaim of his interest in that property to Jane Combs' niece, Sarah Rhodes. Sarah had inherited the property after Jane's death in 1870. That quitclaim formalized what had been an unauthorized sale of property by a free woman of color and the illegal manumission of a slave. So this was a complicated case, and it covered a lot of territory. We used the Family Search Wiki extensively, the catalog, Wikipedia, WorldCat, Google search engine, the three websites that I regularly turn to for digitized books from the 19th and earlier centuries, Google Books, HathiTrust, Internet Archive. We use the US GenWeb archives, Google Maps and Google Earth, the Newberry Atlas of Historical County Boundaries, the overlay for Google Earth. We made use of timelines and tables. The records we covered included popular magazines, academic journals, local histories published in the 19th century, the codified state statutes, historical maps, newspapers, city directories, deeds, censuses, Freedmen's Bank records, the Registry of Free Persons of Color, property tax records, court records, and probate records. 4 key lessons were illustrated by this case study. 1, pay attention to the details. 2, focus on a clear goal and let that guide your research. Regularly review and assess your evidence. And finally, don't restrict yourself to the old and familiar record sets. Use the Family Search Wiki, the catalog, and reach out to local experts for advice on record sets that might be unfamiliar to you.